and ask the question yourself, just put a star in the chat and I'll unmute you at the end of the discussion. But we'll get started because I know Jeremy has a lot to talk about. The intro, Jeremy Beckham is a Research Advocacy Coordinator for Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, PCRM, where he works on efforts to replace the use of animals in laboratory experimentation with superior human relevant research methods. As part of his work, Jeremy works with peer-reviewed journals to improve their publication standards, fights for greater transparency surrounding taxpayer-supported research, and advocates for an immediate end to animal experimentation for both ethical and scientific reasons. And before we get started, I want you all to answer a poll for me real quick, just so we get a temperature of what the room here is like. I'm putting that in the chat. If you could take a few seconds to just answer that. I think it's anonymous, so feel free to let your true feelings be known, and then I'll kind of give the results after you're all done. Are you able to access that, everyone? It's in the little chat. Cool, I have 3 responses so far. I'll give a little bit more time. 5 responses. 10 responses, 11 responses, 16 responses. Here, I might just share my screen so I can show you all what the responses are so far. I'll stop your sharing for just a brief moment, Jeremy.
Okay.
And here we go. We have 22 responses. Looks like most of you are 1, but we have some people who are in favor of research. So that's good. Hopefully we can have a variety of perspectives and questions. I'm hoping for some nice dialogue at the end of the presentation. Everybody, there's a couple more people who have joined. Oops, I'm gonna stop share real fast. So I'll just put the poll in the chat again so everybody else can answer the question too. And we've got 25 responses so far. I'll just share briefly so everyone can see.
Oh, sorry, I think I started mine again.
Oh, sorry.
We'll stop.
Okay. That's all right. Okay, so the question was, number 1 was, is it ethically and morally justified to use animals in invasive or deadly research for the purpose of advancing knowledge or human health? 48% said strong no, 8% said yes, and then we have some people in between. And then number 2 is it scientifically valid to use non-humans as models of human disease or drug response? 50% now, oops, no. 42% said no, and 3.8% said yes. So yeah, that's where we stand right now. I'll stop my share and let Jeremy get started, and feel free to continue to answer those questions, and we'll look at those again at the end. All right, take it away, Jeremy.
Okay, first, can everyone hear me and see my screen okay?
I can.
Okay, excellent. I'll just assume that's the case for everybody. Well, thanks everyone for coming to this. I'm hoping to talk myself for maybe around 45 minutes or so, and then we can reserve the rest of the time for kind of an open dialogue or Q&A. A couple months ago, the organization that I work with, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, was in a lot of the news because we had filed some complaints, including a lawsuit about some experiments that were occurring at the University of California, Davis, funded by Elon Musk's company Neuralink. And when we were in the news a lot during that time, Crystal reached out to me and asked if I'd be willing to kind of give a presentation about that. But I also wanted to kind of talk a little bit more, not just about this specific example, because really in many ways, what was happening inside that UC Davis laboratory is not unique. We have a systemic problem of animal research nationwide. And I wanted to kind of also put that into a little bit of context and talk about the, sort of a global look at the animal research enterprise in the United States and both the ethical and scientific problems with it. So let's go ahead and get started here. If I can get this to work. Okay. So the first thing is I want to just talk about numbers. When we talk about animals used in laboratory research in the United States, how many animals are we talking about? Well, the answer is pretty shocking. It's an estimated 100 million animals are used in laboratory research in the United States each year. Of course, the overwhelming majority of these animals don't make it out of the laboratory alive. There's a very small number of lucky survivors that do get adopted out, but 99.99% will lose their life in the laboratory as well. And next to the meat, dairy, and egg industry, this is actually the largest exploited industry of animals. 100 million animals is more than the number of animals killed in the fur trade, more than used in circuses and the entertainment industries. So right after factory farming for food products, you have animals used and killed for science. And we have to say an estimated 100 million animals, by the way, because no one is keeping an official count nationwide, especially of rats, mice, birds, cold-blooded animals, and animals used for agricultural research. Those animals are specifically excluded under the Federal Animal Welfare Act. They're actually not even considered animals under the statute. They're defined out of that term. So no one is counting those animals. But the best estimate that we have comes from, it's actually an animal researcher or someone affiliated with animal research at the University of California, San Francisco, named Larry Carbone. And a few years ago, he did a survey of all of the largest laboratories in the country of how many mice and rats they use each year in research. And then when he took the numbers he got from that sample and extrapolated them to all of the laboratories that we know that exist in the United States, we ended up with this number. So this is the best estimate that we have of how many animals are used in laboratory research, 100 million. These are the animals that are most commonly used. And some of these next few pictures may be a little bit graphic, so I want to warn you, and I'll let you know when I'm done with the pictures so you can look back at the screen if this thing kind of upsets you. But mice are by far the most common animal that you'll find in laboratories. And then there's rats as well. Rabbits are used. Guinea pigs. Dogs. And many of you may know, I actually used to work for an organization called Beagle Freedom Project and used to coordinate the rescue of beagles from laboratories, but beagles are the most common breed of dog used in laboratory research. Cats, this picture actually was taken at the University of Utah, which is my alma mater. Monkeys, this is also another picture from the University of Utah. And there are still a handful of chimpanzees that are mostly just being warehoused in laboratory experiments. One rare victory that this movement did achieve was about 10 years ago, the National Institutes of Health announced a new policy that they would no longer fund research involving chimpanzees. And ever since then, there's still been this protracted battle to retire the small number of chimpanzees left in laboratories to sanctuaries. But we haven't retired them all, so there are still a few facilities around the country with chimpanzees. So here's a pie chart that I made. This is taken from 2019 USDA statistics. And this left chart here, I'm not sure if folks can see my cursor, but this left pie chart here, this part here, this overwhelming part of the pie chart are animals that are excluded from coverage under the Animal Welfare Act. This is rats, mice, birds bred for laboratory research, animals used for agricultural research purposes, cold-blooded animals. All of those animals are completely exempt. And as you can see, that's the overwhelming majority of animals used in research have no protection under federal animal welfare laws at all. The Animal Welfare Act only concerns itself with this tiny little sliver right here. And if we were to extrapolate that small sliver and turn it into its own pie chart here on the right, you can get a sense of how many animals are used. And there's kind of a legend down here. I'm actually a little colorblind, so I hope other folks are able to, to make sense of the different portions of the chart. But you know, I believe this would be dogs, and I know that there's around 60,000 dogs used in research each year. There's around 100,000 primates who are used in research each year. So you can kind of get a sense here of the different species. This little sliver right here would be cats. There's around 20,000 cats used in research each year. So generally speaking, how are animals used in laboratory research? Different people could kind of conceptualize it in different ways, but here's kind of the 6 categories that I've conceptualized it, because I think each one of these sort of forms its own distinct purpose, as well as institutional supports around it. And so each one of them kind of has to be dealt with in a different way or responded to differently. But the first is spare parts. So this is basically just using animals to breed them and harvest their organs for xenotransplantation or heart valves. They're not being used to publish papers, to get any kind of data. It's just to grow parts. Kind of similarly, they're used as factories for biological products. The most common one that you see still to this day is the manufacture of monoclonal antibodies, which are used in a large range of research. They're also used as models of human disease for basic research. So this is research that's occurring at university campuses all around the country, where you have professors of neuroscience, infectious disease, whatever it may be, trying to create some version of a human disease. It could be heart disease, it could be Parkinson's disease, some rough version of that in an animal to try to supposedly understand the human disease a little better by looking at the animal. They're also used as models for toxicity or drug efficacy, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. Animals can also be used as pedagogical tools. So this would be things like dissection or live animal labs. So this is students who are learning some sort of practice or trade. They get to practice first on an animal, whether it's a live animal or a dead animal. And then veterinary medicine research. This is using animals to learn about the disease in that same species of animal for the purpose of veterinary medicine application. And some of the scientific critiques that you'll hear me kind of talk about in this talk don't necessarily apply to veterinary medicine research in the same way, because in that case, those animals are just representing other members of their species. So who pays for animal research? Well, it is big business, and the National Institutes of Health, which is part of the federal government, is the single largest funder of animal experimentation worldwide. The NIH, which has, I believe, 27 different constituent agencies that make it up, it has an annual budget of $43 billion, and about half of that goes to animal research. And folks, in just the same way that the Department of Defense handing out money, handing out huge handouts to contractors has created what some people call a military industrial complex, we have a research industrial complex in the United States. All of that money, that $21.5 roughly billion that goes to animal research that flows from the NIH, it goes somewhere. It goes to universities. It ends up in the hands of companies that breed these animals for research. It ends up in the hands of the individuals carrying out the research. And all of them have a vested interest in ensuring that this practice continues unabated. And I think that that's a piece of this puzzle that a lot of people can easily forget, the strong financial incentives to keep this system going. And there's also a large industry of privately funded research. This industry involves the breeding facilities, medical device manufacturers, the pharmaceutical industry, and contract research organizations, or CROs. Contract research organizations are basically laboratories for hire. There was a very high profile one back when I was first getting involved in animal protection called Huntington Life Sciences. That's a contract research organization. Other companies pay them to carry out a very specific test that they've contracted with on animals. It's often the pharmaceutical industry, but it could be the pesticide company, it could be food manufacturers. They will contract with a contract research organization to do a very specific experiment, give them the data, and then they walk away. And this is a quote. Oh, I should have warned everybody. Sorry, the next slide has a couple more graphic pictures. I like to tell this story really quickly. So these photographs came from a cat experiment that was going on at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I formerly worked for PETA, and when I was there, we got these photographs through an open records request. And the university fought like hell giving us these pictures, and it's not hard to imagine why they fought it so hard. We had to sue them. Eventually, they were forced to release these photographs to us, and they were horrible experiments. But one thing that I wanted to really highlight is this quote here. This quote is from this same experiment that you see pictured here, and it comes from the animal use protocol that was approved by the university's oversight committee. And the protocol is essentially a detailed plan for the research that the experimenter, they're called the principal investigator. They're basically the head of that particular research project. The principal investigator submits the protocol to the oversight committee to get approval. On this protocol, one of the questions was, please provide a justification for animal use. And this was part of his justification for animal use. He said, in 30 years, we have averaged 30 cats per year in our experiment. This number allows us to keep up a productive publication record that ensures our constant funding. So the publications and the funding to people who are really enmeshed in this environment of the research enterprise, that is itself an end. That is itself a justification for what you see here. The fact that their institution is getting funding and they're able to publish papers. It's so detached at this point from anything about new clinical therapies or new drugs. The publications themselves can be a justification now. Now I want to mention really quick, when we're talking about animal research, I think that there are two completely distinct critiques of animal research. And I worked with Crystal on that poll question that went out at the top of this presentation to kind of represent these two questions. And I honestly think, reasonable people with an open mind can come to different conclusions, even opposing conclusions on these two questions. But the first question is a scientific one, which is, can the use of animals reliably provide us with useful information about human disease pathology, as well as provide data to allow us to form good predictions for toxicity or drug efficacy? In other words, if I'm using a rat or I'm using a dog to try to understand a disease, can that dog give me data that actually can then be applied to humans who are suffering from that disease? Or if I give a dog or a rat or a monkey a drug and I see that it kills that animal, can I reasonably infer based on that it's going to kill the person? That's the scientific question summed up really briefly. The second question is an ethical one, and that is it morally acceptable to use non-human animals in invasive experimentation that would be clearly unethical if carried out in human subjects? And we clearly understand that this is an important distinction with other humans, right? We have very strong ethical guidelines involving human volunteers in clinical research. They have to provide informed consent. We have to have reason to believe that the individuals participating in the research, if we're going to give them any kind of risky therapeutic, that there is at least an equal chance that the individuals in the research study will actually benefit from what's being tested on them. Those kinds of ethical questions, right? We can't just grab people off the street, put them in cages, test experimental drugs on them, even if we think we might learn something, even if we think that kind of randomized control trial could actually inform us. We think that that's ethically off limits. And so the question is, should it be ethically off limits for animals too? And my answer to both of these questions is no. The use of animal models is not a scientifically valid scientific paradigm, and it's also unethical. And I'll talk a little bit about why I come to those conclusions. First, the scientific failure of animal models. In one sentence, here's the problem with animals used in research. While humans share a lot in common with other animals, there are important biological differences between species that make their use as predictive models for human disease and drug response problematic. And specifically, in the 21st century, we are now studying all of these fields: toxicity, drug response, disease, pharmacology, pharmacokinetics. All of these things are now being studied on a molecular and on a genetic level. And it is precisely at this level of analysis that a human becomes a human and a mouse becomes a mouse, and these models start to break down. Let me talk just for a little bit more about what I mean by that. 400 years ago, when we did not understand hardly anything about the circulatory system, you had scientists cutting up horses and saying, look, The horse has a 4-chambered heart. I guess a human has a 4-chambered heart. And one of the reasons they were turning to horses, by the way, was because that there were religious dogmas at the time that made it impossible to carry out autopsies. So they kind of had to use horses or even primates and look at their heart. And it is true that mammals, all mammals, have a 4-chambered heart like a human does, okay? So on that kind of gross anatomical level, we can say that animals are similar to humans. But the problem is the kinds of questions we're asking now are so specific and so related to protein interactions, cellular receptors, cellular signaling, things where genes and molecules interact on such a subtle level that these differences between species suddenly become very relevant. And we see empirically the results of this breakdown in the paradigm, specifically the fact that 95%, this is a statistic from the FDA, 95% of drugs that appear safe and effective in animal trials go on to fail in clinical trials in humans, often in phase 1 studies. That's the very first time it's tested on a small group of human volunteers strictly to test the safety profile of the drug. We can tell even at that point the animals were misleading us 95% of the time. That's a remarkable statistic, if you ask me, that 95% of the time the drugs that look safe and effective in animal trials go on to fail in clinical trials. Here's that problem visualized, okay? So you have preclinical is basically a euphemism for animal research. So you have all of these medications that progress beyond preclinical, and they submit to the FDA what's called an investigational new drug application. That means we want to start going to clinical trials. So they go to phase 1, and already we were cut down in half. And then at the end of phase 2 trials, we're cut down in half again. And then in the end of phase 3 trials, we have hardly anything left compared to what we started with. All of this process. So it's pretty interesting. Here it is visualized. These were a couple papers that I found looking at different pharmacologically active substances and comparing the human bioavailability of that drug to what was seen in laboratory animal research. Bioavailability is a term that's used in pharmacology that basically means how much of the drug is actually absorbed and makes it into the bloodstream. Okay, it's a very important metric to learn, especially when you have like pills or some other oral route of administration. Okay, that's how you know how much of that drug is actually going to end up being active in that person's system. And look at this graph here. You know, on the x-axis, you see the animal bioavailability. The y-axis is the human. These different shapes represent, these are the 3 most common species used for drug testing. So all the triangles are dogs, all the circles are rodents, and all the squares are primates. And this is almost a scattergram. There's so little correlation. I mean, look at over here. In this drug here, you had something like 75% animal bioavailability and almost nothing in humans, and vice versa up here. This is almost a scattergram, and there's really no clear pattern as to whether or not the rodents tend to perform better than the dogs, which tend to perform better than the primates. Here was another very similar graph I found, looking at other drugs. Complete mess. How are you supposed to use this data to form predictions as to how these substances are going to perform in humans? And we kind of understand this on a common sense level, don't we? You know, here's a graphic that I grabbed from the ASPCA's website about the world's most dangerous foods for dogs. Grapes, very toxic to dogs. Onions and garlic can also cause damage to dogs. Alcohol, caffeine, chocolate. That's something we almost all know, right? That chocolate can be very toxic to dogs. So if we had tested chocolate on dogs during pre-market approval, it's not clear that the FDA would have ever authorized chocolate for human consumption. Something to think about. Xylitol is actually highly toxic. This is an artificial sweetener in dogs. Highly toxic. Everyone should be very careful if you have dogs at home leaving down gum or candy that has xylitol. So this right here, I think, kind of captures what we mean when we say animals are not just furry surrogates for humans in terms of biological response. And let's look at just a few historical examples of where that mentality has led us astray. Let's talk about tobacco. For decades, the tobacco industry was trying to suppress information that was coming out from epidemiological studies and clinical studies showing the association between smoking and a whole host of disease, including heart disease and cancer. And one of the ways they confused the public most effectively was by contracting out and carrying out a variety of animal experiments. They forced beagles and rats and monkeys to smoke the equivalent of 10, 12 packs a day. And then they said, hey, look, these animals aren't getting cancer from even enormous exposures to tobacco smoke. We're not seeing these cancers develop. Take a look at this. This is from a New York Times article from 1991, an interview with the CEO of Philip Morris. This was when there were a lot of congressional hearings going on about whether or not we should more heavily regulate tobacco and also require the tobacco corporations to start paying for state Medicaid budgets, which ended up happening through something called the Master Settlement Agreement. There's an interview that the New York Times did. President and CEO of Philip Morris. They said, does cigarette smoking cause cancer? This is in 1991. He answers, to my knowledge, it's not been proven that cigarette smoking causes cancer. What do you base that on? I base that on the fact that traditionally there is, in scientific terms, there are hurdles related to causation. And at this time, there is no evidence that they have been able to reproduce cancer in animals from cigarette smoking. So how many lives were lost during these decades when the public was confused about tobacco smoking based on erroneous data we were getting from animal models? Similarly, let's talk about polio. Ironically, this is one of the examples that animal experimenters like to tout, but if you dig into it, and I highly recommend, there's actually an excellent book about polio that's just called Polio, won the Pulitzer Prize. And this was an interesting quote that I found in this. Dr. Al Sabin was the hero who invented the oral polio vaccine, which is the reason that this disease has been nearly eradicated worldwide. And he said, quote, prevention of polio was long delayed by the erroneous conception of the nature of the human disease based on misleading experimental models of the disease on monkeys. And the reason for that is that macaque monkeys contract polio through the nasal passage, whereas in humans, it's gastrointestinally. So these two different understandings of how the virus was contracting meant that researchers pursued this blind alley. They developed all these vaccines that were nasal sprays in children. A lot of children actually lost their sense of smell forever with these experimental nasal vaccines, and that was all based on misleading monkey data. Penicillin is another example. Penicillin was our first antibiotic, revolutionized how we treat infectious disease. It was first tested in vitro, that basically means cells grown in culture, and in rabbits by Alexander Fleming in 1929. And Dr. Fleming saw that it was effective at killing the growth of bacteria in the petri dish, and it was also effective topically on the rabbits, on their skin. However, when it was given to the rabbits orally, it had no effect on systemic infection. So penicillin was put back on the shelf for over a decade until another scientist reached for it again out of desperation to try to treat somebody who was dying of syphilis. And then it worked. We now know that in rabbits, most of the penicillin is not absorbed. That goes back to that bioavailability thing I just showed. And it ends up being excreted in the urine. And Howard Florey, who was one of the scientists responsible for first purifying and pharmacologically producing penicillin, said this: mice were used in the initial toxicity tests because of their small size. But what a lucky chance it was, for in this respect, man is like the mouse and not the guinea pig. If we had used guinea pigs exclusively, we should have said that penicillin was toxic, and we probably would not have proceeded to try and overcome the difficulties of producing the substance for trial in man. So the point I'm raising here is take a look at this. Guinea pigs, mice, and rabbits, 3 different species, 3 different reactions, okay? It kills the guinea pigs. It's ineffective in the rabbits because it's excreted in the urine, and it's a successful therapeutic in mice, sort of like people, okay? So if you don't know yet how penicillin behaves in humans, and you test this drug in 3 different animals and get 3 different responses, how in the world are you supposed to extrapolate those results to understand how it's going to behave in the human? You simply can't. So turning now a little bit to what happens to animals in labs and some of the ethical issues with this. Well, I can tell you, I've been working on this issue now for 15 to 20 years, and I've read countless published papers, protocols, vet records from inside labs, and there's almost no form of abuse that you can imagine, truly, that isn't being done on an animal somewhere in a laboratory, okay? Animals in laboratories are intentionally poisoned. That's common in toxicity testing. They're infected with diseases. Often when we have treatments for those diseases intentionally withheld because we want to see how the disease behaves in the animal. Animals who are normally very social are isolated from one another routinely. And conversely, animals are often overcrowded in cages. They can be exposed to extreme heat or cold. They're often deprived of food or water, especially in behavioral studies. They're subjected to electroshocks. They're subjected to thermal injuries, which basically means they're burned. There's something called the forced swim test, where we drop mice into little beakers of water and see how long it takes for them to swim before they give up, thinking that they're going to drown. And then they also have, in neurological experiments, very commonly, highly invasive hardware implanted in their heads and skulls. And we'll talk about that with the UC Davis experiments. And the legal protections for animals in labs are very weak. Most states in the US specifically exclude animals used in laboratory research from any protection under their cruelty to animal statute, okay? So when it comes to the state laws, they got no luck whatsoever. And then when it comes to the federal laws, Federal Animal Welfare Act is the only law protecting animals in laboratories. And as I showed you on that earlier pie chart, it doesn't even apply to 99% of animals used in research, okay? And the last time this law was strengthened for animals was 1985, almost 40 years ago, was the last time we've gone and updated this law and added some new protections. And the Animal Welfare Act, importantly, does not even cover the experimental methods themselves. There's actually a phrase that the members of Congress used when this law passed originally, and that phrase was, "The researcher still holds the key to the laboratory door." And the point was, we don't want to mess with the research itself. We just want to say they have clean cages, they've got cages of a certain size, and you're filling out the right paperwork and getting it approved by the right people. But in terms of the experiment itself, there is no such thing as an illegal experiment. No such thing, okay? And even this pathetically weak law that we have, multiple audits by the USDA's Office of Inspector General have found that the Animal Welfare Act enforcement system is not effective at deterring violations of these weak standards, and that many laboratories, even when they do get fines, they're so paltry that they just associate it with a cost of doing business, and it doesn't actually deter future violations. Audit after audit has found this. And take a look at how pathetic these regulations are, okay? I actually grabbed this screenshot myself from this was a material put out by the animal research industry about husbandry practices for using dogs in research. And it points out correctly, nothing in here is incorrect, by the way. Dogs in legal-sized cages must be removed from their cages provided an opportunity to exercise, unless they are housed in a cage that has more than twice the required floor space under the Animal Welfare Act. If that's the case, the law says that dog can exercise in their cage and they never have to come out of that cage. This picture right here you're seeing on the left is a dog housed in a cage that is actually more than twice the required size. So this dog in that cage right there on the left never has to come out of their cage for exercise, because they say they can exercise sufficiently in that size of cage. Pretty crazy. And it's very difficult. All of these barriers that I've talked about with the weaknesses in the law, the weaknesses of the enforcement, it's very difficult when you do get people who are on the inside of these laboratories or on the IACUCs or on the vet care team to actually make a difference because of all these structural barriers. It's hard to know even where you can turn, okay? The IACUC, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, that is the committee that is the primary oversight mechanism in every animal research laboratory. That group of people approves the experiments and is the one that responds to internal whistleblower complaints or reports. But they are typically staffed almost entirely. Sometimes I've seen like 20 out of 23 members of this committee are animal researchers themselves at the very institution that they're overseeing. So they're all insiders, rubber stamping things, okay? And the environment as well is very repressive against those who speak up publicly about animal research, even if it's just they're not even necessarily opposed to animal research. But if they say anything publicly that might reflect negatively on the institution, the consequences can be pretty severe. And I've seen several wrongful termination lawsuits brought by veterinarians against the labs that they used to work for. And almost always what ends up happening is the research laboratory settles out of court, gives them a large sum of money, and in exchange, that veterinarian signs a non-disclosure agreement. And the general public never really hears exactly what they saw, other than their initial complaint, which says they were terminated because they were raising concerns about the treatment of animals. That's all we know. And the research lab shuts it down with the exchange of a settlement, okay? I'll give you another example that I know personally. There's a wonderful person named Amy Kerwin in Madison, Wisconsin. And years and years ago, I was protesting outside the University of Wisconsin-Madison's primate laboratory. They have a huge primate lab there. She actually worked at this facility at the time I was there. And she came out and had a conversation with me while I was there, and actually was definitely taking an opposing side. She was trying to convince me that the work that they were doing was advancing science, that they cared about the animals, and that I was, buying a bunch of crazy PETA propaganda, okay? We had, a healthy discussion, and that was what I basically thought was the end of it. Until a few months later, she reached out to me and said, other people in my laboratory saw me talking to you and reported me. And she had to go and meet with the head of the lab, and the head of the lab said, we told everyone on staff that they were not allowed to talk to the protesters outside at all. And you were out there talking to them. What was that about? She said, well, I just wanted to have a conversation with them. And from that moment, she was viewed so suspiciously by other people at the laboratory. They took away her key to the building. They never allowed her to be alone in any of the rooms with laboratories. They were probably paranoid that she might take photographs or video. And it became such a hostile environment that she eventually just had to leave. And since this all happened, actually, Amy has formed a sanctuary in Wisconsin called Primates Incorporated for monkeys who were formerly used in research. And you wouldn't believe the resistance that she has met in the industry simply to retire monkeys after they've been used in laboratory research. The laboratory has no more functional need for these monkeys, and yet they still don't want to let their animals go to her sanctuary. It's pretty remarkable. There was also a study, or an example I remember a while ago, of a member of an IACUC at the University of Florida. She came to an animal protection conference and presented just about animal research. She wanted to give the animal researchers perspective, talk about her experience on the IACUC at this conference. And when the University of Florida found out about this, and they found out about it because of a pro-animal research group called National Association for Biomedical Research, said, hey, did you know that a member of your IACUC went and spoke at this animal protection conference? She was immediately fired from her committee just for presenting her perspective at this conference. So there's a lot of barriers. These next couple slides, again, may be a little bit graphic, but I just want to sort of show you what it is that people see on a regular basis. These beagles right here are kept in what's called metabolism cages, where they're isolated completely alone. And the reason they do that is because they want to be able to capture the waste products from those animals to analyze their waste products and also be able to understand what their food intake was. So as a result, those beagles are isolated in those tiny cages for their whole lives. Same thing with monkeys. Sometimes monkeys can be isolated in a cage like you're seeing there on the right for up to 15, 20, even 25 years. And these are highly social animals. They experience hair pulling, hair loss, self-mutilation. They'll circle endlessly in their cages. It's called stereotypic behavior due to the stress from this environment. And there is an interesting study that I like to talk about with rhesus monkeys that was done where one monkey, they trained a monkey to receive food by pulling a chain. And this monkey would never get food unless they pulled this chain. And then what they did was they brought in a second monkey and they strapped that second monkey to a chair. And whenever the first monkey pulled chain to get food, that second monkey received a powerful electric shock. And what they found was that that first monkey would forego food for as long as 10 days rather than shocking another monkey. And crazy enough too, monkeys who had previously been in that chair receiving those shocks were even less likely to pull that chain and shock another monkey because they were able to put themselves in the shoes of that monkey and know how painful it is. So these are remarkable beings with really interesting minds. They're so much like us. You know, I often read about the intelligence, the emotions of these animals. This is a macaque's hand. Look at how human-like that is and how much we can relate to what that would feel like to grab those cage bars. And I just ask myself, you know, how like us do these animals have to be before they finally start registering as an individual with moral worth that can't be used for exploitive experimentation? And we just draw an ethical line in just the same way we do for humans and say it's immoral to grab those animals and use them in harmful research without their consent, because they're like us in all of the ways that matter. They experience the world very similarly to the way we do, and they value their lives. And I think that this is part of a general paradigm shift that we're seeing about our place in the world, okay? For a long time, humans thought we were just the center of the universe, even literally. The sun revolved around us and all of nature. Look at this chart. This great chain of being, it's sometimes called, where all life forms are working their way up to the pinnacle, which is man, right? And now we know this is actually a very outdated and actually scientifically incorrect view of evolution and how humans evolved. And in fact, there is no higher or lower in evolutionary development. You may have forms that are more complex or less complex, but it turns out we're not actually more or less complex than a gorilla or even a rat, okay? We're just different. There's no higher and lower. And this actually is from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Tree of Life. This is more how we view our relationship, biologists do, in the living world now, where humans are just in this general web or this bush of life instead of this hierarchy. I don't even know where humans are. We're just somewhere over here. And we've all co-evolved and we've had common ancestors at some point in evolutionary history, but no one is above anyone else. So now, let me talk a little bit about, that's kind of the end of the background information. I want to talk about a case study. We talk about animal research in general. Let's see how it was put into practice here with this experiment at the University of California, Davis. So a few years ago, the Physicians Committee learned about through public reports that Elon Musk was launching a new company called Neuralink, okay? And the goal of Neuralink was to merge the human brain with artificial intelligence, because Elon Musk believes that essentially human cyborgs are the next frontier of our development. It sounds science fiction, but this is actually what he states in his public speeches about this company, okay? He says, I created Neuralink specifically to address the artificial intelligence symbiosis problem, which I think is an existential threat. The purpose of this company is to develop a neural interface, a computer device that can actually be implanted directly into your brain that allows you to wirelessly communicate with devices, with computers, with simply the power of thought. So if this were to theoretically catch on, there'd be no need for computer keyboards or mouses anymore. You'd be able to just think and the cursor would move and words would appear on your screen, or you'd be able to get into a Tesla and just think about where you wanted to go and the car would be able to move around. And the long-term goal is to get a mass manufactured consumer device that's implanted inside the brains of every man, woman, and child in the United States. Hundreds of millions of people with a device implanted in their brain. I think this raises quite a lot of ethical concerns. I'm not sure I want to live in this future, but the main thing that grabbed our concern was the fact that they said at the beginning they were starting animal studies on this. And when you're talking about invasive brain experiments like this, I know from experience it's often going to be pretty horrendous. The public report said they were partnering with UC Davis, which is a public university. That means they're subject to open records laws. So Physicians Committee filed open records requests for the protocol, that's the written description of what they want to do to the animals, as well as the vet and care records, necropsy reports related to these experiments. We initially got back records that looked like this, heavily redacted, and vet records were entirely withheld. Physicians Committee's attorneys had to threaten litigation, and the University of California ended up handing over more information under the threat of litigation about what they were doing in these experiments that were funded by Neuralink and about their whole relationship with this company. So UC Davis entered into a contract with this private company. So here's what we learned when we reviewed the protocol. And the next 3 slides contain some graphic images, okay? These are monkeys used in similar neurological research, but they are not from this particular UC Davis laboratory. Right now, we are actually suing to try to get photographs from this specific laboratory, but we don't have them yet. So I want to show you other photographs that are similar, okay, that involve similar neural prosthesis type research. And it's from a laboratory called the Max Planck Institute. And these are going to be pretty graphic. I'm just going to warn you, okay? What this type of research does is they first take monkeys and they drill an aperture into the top of their skull. And actually in the Neuralink experiment, they drilled bilateral. So there was one in the left hemisphere of the brain and one in the right hemisphere in the brain, not just one in the middle like this. But they cut open a portion of the animal's skull, peel back these protective layers that cover the brain, and expose the surface of the brain. And then they actually place micro threads, electrodes that can read brain activity. And then those micro threads go up to that little cylinder you see there. Sometimes it's called a pillbox or a head post. It has several different colloquial terms for it. But that can then be connected up to computer hardware to measure the electrical activity of an individual's brain. Okay, as you can see from this picture, this is an extremely invasive process. The skull is not meant to have giant holes permanently drilled into it. The skull even tries to heal. You can see that even in this picture. The skull continually tries to heal and actually melds with that, and it causes intense pain and itching. The animals are constantly picking at their head, they're bleeding, it gets infected. All of that is very common with this type of experimentation. So the monkeys live with this implant in their head, in their cage. They have to be isolated in their cage when they have that implant put in their head so that other monkeys don't pick at it as well. When it comes time to use them in a recording session, they do this system called a pole and collar, where they latch this pole onto the collar that's always around that monkey's neck, and they drag them into a restraint chair, which is then hooked up to different wires to read the activity of that monkey's brain. Okay? And very similar types of experiments were happening in Neuralink. And Neuralink, we learned from the records we got, paid UC Davis $1.4 million over a period of 3 years to do this type of experiment to 22 different monkeys at the university. The majority of those monkeys were implanted and lost their lives. At the very end of 2020, this relationship ended, and there were 8 monkeys shipped from UC Davis to Neuralink's facility in Fremont, California. And at the time they were shipped, those monkeys did not yet have the implants in their brains, but Neuralink likely continued that process behind their laboratory walls. We also got individual records for the monkeys. And I went over these records myself, about 600 pages, and they were absolutely heartbreaking. Okay, and this is what they looked like. And these records reveal that these monkeys had repeated infections of the implant sites. They were constantly prescribed antibiotics because they would get infected. And then the antibiotics, these heavy-duty antibiotics, would actually wipe out their gut microbiome. So then the animals would experience gastrointestinal problems. So they'd have to let up off the antibiotics and maybe even give them a probiotic to deal with the chronic diarrhea and the vomiting. And once they let up off of them, the infections returned. So it was this constant seesaw between infections and gastrointestinal problems in these monkeys. The animals were picking and pulling at their implants constantly. They had a loss of coordination, most likely just due to the brain damage from the implant itself. Many of the monkeys had seizures and were even prescribed anticonvulsants to try to deal with that. They had head pressing, which is a stereotypic behavior where they're constantly pushing their head against either the floor of the cage or a wall of the cage. It's probably because the monkey has a severe headache and it can't be relieved. And in a couple really disturbing incidents, these animals actually had this substance called bioglue, which they used to seal that recording chamber into their head. That bioglue actually seeped down through the skull in the space between the implant and the skull and onto the surface of the brain, causing brain hemorrhaging. And 2 monkeys actually died as a result of this. We saw repeated mentions in these records of the animals being lethargic, depressed, having significant weight loss, hair loss. Here's a couple excerpts. I think I grabbed 3 excerpts to kind of show you what we saw, okay? This says animal laying down at the front of the cage to hold hands with and groom a visual buddy. A visual buddy means it's not a cage mate, but it's someone in the next cage over that they can reach through and maybe hold hands with another monkey because they can't share a cage together. Animal reported for possible head pressing. Observed animal position with head down on floor multiple times in 10 minutes. This monkey was prescribed a pain-relieving drug to manage injuries from SIB, which is self-injurious behavior, okay? The self-mutilation that this monkey was doing was so severe they had to be given a pain-relieving drug. This animal, I saw this a lot. Small amount of yellow crusting at implant margin, noted small amount of scratching at head implant during observation. So that's just signs of the infection. This was one of the animals who died from the bioglue. It was determined at necropsy. And this animal, it says, animal having gasping episode 2 to 3 times after monitoring for about 15-minute observations. Animal stretched and changed posture, then open mouth gasping and retching almost, and then deep breaths as she appeared to collapse from exhaustion and fatigue. Upon reviewing the monitoring tape, noted that this animal has had multiple episodes since 5:40 this morning, or sorry, I think it's 6:40, I miswrote that, but it's 6:40. And the episodes are happening more closely together. In between episodes, animal is quiet, not eating or drinking, can stand when encouraged, though the right leg is weak and unable to support much weight. And their assessment is that this monkey has declining condition with respiratory component. And this all happened not long after that monkey got that implant put in their brain. And then when they eventually, the veterinarian ordered this monkey be euthanized because of their condition, and they performed necropsy and found that that bioglue had seeped down and actually damaged parts of that monkey's brain. And that's a severe problem. And what we did, the Physicians Committee, when we got all this information, we filed a complaint under the Animal Welfare Act with the USDA, because even though these laws and these rules are very weak, and in many ways, the most we can hope for, I hate to say it, is a warning, a written warning saying that they violated the law. But we do believe that that was a violation of the law, because that substance, bioglue, was not approved for use in this way. And in fact, the FDA has a black box warning on that drug saying that this is known to be toxic to nervous tissue. And obviously the brain is a giant bundle of nervous tissue. So they should have known that this substance would have done that to that monkey. Okay, so that was part of our complaint to the USDA. And the USDA has already inspected both Neuralink and UC Davis. They've confirmed to us, and we're just still waiting to hear back on the results of their formal investigation. We've also filed a lawsuit in Davis, California, under the California Public Records Act. You may recall a few pages ago, right here, where it says, upon reviewing the video monitoring tape. Well, we want that tape, and UC Davis has not given us to date any video or any photographs related to these experiments. And I think it's almost surely because they know that the public would be really upset if they saw what these monkeys' lives were like. And they almost admitted as much. This is from UC Davis's answer in court. This is their justification for keeping these photographs secret, is that the pathologists need to be able to take the photos without concern about how the photos might look to members of the public who are untrained in the pathology procedure. So as someone involved in this field of advocacy for such a long time, I can tell you when I hear them say how it might look to members of the public, I know that we're onto something and that these photographs and video are going to be very disturbing. And if we can get them, just like we got those cat photos I showed you earlier, and publicize them, it might lead to this laboratory ending this experiment, okay? So thank you. I think I went a little bit longer than I anticipated. I'm sorry for that, but that's the end of my talk, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Awesome. That was great. No worries that it went long. I think we're all pretty fascinated by that. I went to UC Davis for undergrad and vet school. I studied animal science. I worked in some labs, mostly with horses, though. I knew people who worked at the Primate Research Center. These aren't monsters. They're not bad people. I got sucked into it too. You just become normalized to the culture there. Like you believe you have this reverence for UC Davis. Like first I'm like, I got into UC Davis. Oh my God, I got into UC Davis vet school. And you know, you don't want to mentally like shit on UC Davis. You're like, this is a great school. These are great professors. You respect your professors, and you just kind of, you know, when they ask you, you get the opportunity to work in a lab with a professor you like really respect, who you've read their papers. You're like, oh my God, I'm part of this thing. And then they're asking you to do stuff and you don't really question it. You just kind of go along with it. And you know, if you do start to question it and have some ethical concerns, you're like, I'm not gonna rock the boat here. I want to get into vet school, or I want that residency or whatever. I can help change these systems afterwards. I'm not gonna say anything. So yeah, I mean, that was my experience. Like, they're not bad people, but we need people like you to like look at this and go, what is going on here? We have a horrifying system in place that needs changing. This is not right what we're doing. And there's just this institutional inertia to like keep going along with the status quo.
There is.
So yeah, and I'm hoping we foster like an open and compassionate dialogue with the industry. There's too much vilifying on both sides. Like, we're on different teams and the other team is crazy and doesn't know what they're talking about. They don't have all the facts. Like, we need to like get together and be able to talk to each other. And, you know, I was taught at UC Davis that animal rights activists are dangerous, and there's no talking to them. And then, you know, when I got out and knew some animal rights activists, I'm like, oh no, that's not the case. You know, they have some good points here, and we need to start talking with them. And this like vilifying the other side isn't good. And I do have I think you gave me 700-page like public records request, and I can share it with everybody, right?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yep.
There's nothing secret. So if you guys want to see all of the public records, drop your email in the chat. You can also DM me your email address and I can send it to you. I'll put it in a folder and make it public, and I'll share it all with you. Jeremy, would you be interested in like sharing your slides publicly too?
Sure, that's fine.
I can add them to the slides, or add them to my folder as well, and everybody can look at these afterwards. So yeah, let me just go to the questions here. Let's see. Shreya asks, does this number, oh, sorry, you already answered that question. Leaf asks, does this include animals used for body fluid, those numbers like dog for blood transfusions? Imagine.
For blood yeah, it should. So the legal definition of those numbers I showed were animals used for testing, education, science, or research. If it's any one of those four things, they have to get reported to the USDA if they're a reportable species like dogs are. So that would fall under science, I would think. And so that probably would be reported.
Okay. And one question I commonly get from people on the other side who are pro animal experimentation is, well, if we ban a practice here in the United States, it's just going to go to another country where there's less regulations. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, I have a few responses. The first is, there is nowhere in the world where worse things are happening to animals in labs than the United States. So if it, you know, it can't get worse than anywhere else than it is right here, right now. But secondly, I just think that that's sort of an error of thinking in general, and that thinking could lead to all kinds of absurd policy conclusions. Like, maybe we shouldn't have laws against child labor, because all that will happen is that in other countries, you know, child labor will explode. And I just think that, you know, we need to, sometimes the United States can set examples that trickles down to other nations worldwide. And so we should ban it here, and yes, continue to work to ban it worldwide. But we can't allow our own standards to deteriorate out of fear that standards somewhere else are going to be poor. But I also want to emphasize the very first point I made, which is I don't think things are any better in the United States for animals in the labs than they are anywhere else.
Why is it so much worse here in the United States than anywhere else?
Well, the scientific research enterprise in general, worldwide, a lot of it does happen in the United States. And some of that has to do with things like how our intellectual property laws are designed. So you end up getting a lot more research here. There's just an historical, a lot of it just goes back to history, of like the Cold War era. During the Cold War era, the federal government wanted to prove that it was better in the Soviet Union. So it started pouring just billions and billions of dollars into research, especially into polio research. And that whole enterprise, just as we've discussed, ended up kind of getting a life of its own and ended up getting inertia. And you see the NIH budget just balloon and balloon. In fact, this presentation I just gave, I had to look up the NIH budget again. I hadn't looked it up for a few years. And I had to revise my number. The last time I gave this talk about 3 years ago, or a similar talk about the NIH budget, the number was 32 billion. And only a few years later, now it's 43.
Wow.
So, and I mean, I've just seen it even over the last 15 years, the NIH budget just grows and grows and grows. It's, unfortunately, it's like a politically positive thing to fund, even bipartisanly. A lot of both Republicans and Democrats want to pour more money into medical research. And what does that mean? It means increasing the NIH budget. And what does that mean? It means more animals in laboratories. So, you know, there's a lot of historical quirks as to how we got to where we are. But yeah, we're the capital of pretty awful stuff. And we've exported a lot of these practices around the world. We lead the way. You know, I talked about beagles being the breed of choice in labs. That started here in the United States. It actually started here at the University of Utah. That was the first laboratory that used beagles and standardized that practice of beagles being the breed of choice. Now you find beagles in laboratories in China. Okay, but it started here. We often pioneer this stuff and it spreads worldwide.
Yeah, wasn't it started here just because there were a lot of stray beagles on the streets and they can just grab them off the streets, and then that became the dog of choice?
Well, it wasn't so much that. I have
No.
a whole essay about this if you're curious, called Radioactive
Okay.
Beagles. If you Google radioactive beagles, you'll find it. It's open source.
Okay.
But it was Cold War era research on toxicity of radioactive nuclides. And they were setting up a dog colony to test radiation exposure, basically. And they called a few different just neighborhood breeders in Salt Lake. And the one they found had beagles, and they said, hey, we kind of like beagles because they're of a certain size that can be stacked. So their size, their disposition, they're docile. So let's use beagles. And then what happened was, once the U of U started to use beagles, when they set up other similar labs, actually at UC Davis, there was a huge beagle lab there during this time too. They said, well, we want to standardize our data to what they got in Salt Lake. And they used beagles, so we better use beagles too. And which I find very funny. They recognize that there might be differences between breeds of dogs, but it never occurs to them that maybe there's going to be differences between the dogs and the humans. I mean, if there's a difference between beagles and Akitas, there's going to be differences between dogs and the humans. But in any case, so that's kind of how beagles ended up getting standardized.
Interesting. Leaf asks, what percentage of animal research results in good data or data that transfers to the species they are wanting to assist?
So the right question to ask there, though, is what has predictive value? Okay, so think back to that penicillin example that I gave. There was a species that correlated to what we saw in humans. It was the mouse, and we tested it in, it was mice, guinea pigs, and rabbits. Ineffective in rabbits, deadly to guinea pigs, effective in mice. We got 3 different reactions. So you could look at that and say, well, I guess we got the right answer 1/3 of the time. But the problem is that you have to have predictive power there. You have to be able to know beforehand which species is going to mimic the human condition, and you never really can. Because I'll flip the example. There was a substance called thalidomide, which famously caused really serious birth defects for pregnant women who took it in Canada. It was actually never approved in the US, but it was approved in other countries. Pregnant women who took thalidomide, their babies had a condition called phocomelia, which is characterized by misshapen and deformed limbs. okay? Well, when they went back to try to see if the thalidomide might be the cause of the birth defects, they did laboratory animal tests. And they found that rabbits got phocomelia from the thalidomide, but the mice didn't. So here you see an example that was flipped from the penicillin because that drug was metabolized in a different way in the rabbit than was the mouse. So that's kind of the problem. I don't know if that makes sense. So, I mean,
Yeah.
You can say what percentage of the time, you can go back retroactively and say this percent of the time, this animal predicted it right, but that doesn't mean anything for the next drug you go to test. Does that kind of make sense?
Exactly. It's like, how do you know this is gonna make sense? Like it's just a crapshoot pretty much. Another question is, how would legal personhood or recognition of sentience in animals impact animal experimentation enterprise?
Well, I would think that if we extended that concept to animals, I mean, I think it would affect all these exploitive industries. I mean, they would then have standing in court. People could sue on their behalf. You know, they'd be recognized as an individual with interests. Presumably some of the principles, you know, codified in things like the Belmont Report might extend to other animals. So I think it would have, you know, a tremendous impact. And it would be great. You know, that's why, you know, over the years, I've spent a lot of time focusing on primates, actually, because I think that is a kind of a weak point in this, a way to kind of make the whole house of cards fall down. It's to point out, you know, humans are essentially not so special, because I don't think we are. And that other primates are like us in all the ways that matters. And if we can extend personhood, maybe at least to great apes at first, or to all primates, it might make people question the whole paradigm of human supremacy.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I can't wait for that to happen. I even think dogs would be soon too to be persons, because there's just part of our family right now, whereas a great ape might be a little bit distant to us.
True.
But another question is, I have biotech investor friends who say they would like to go to direct to human testing, but the issue is of regulatory submission requirements to get into humans. Lots of animal study data is required, and they even suggest that many companies would be aligned with an effort to change regulatory standards. Could there be an alliance between these types of biotech investor companies and advocates of ending animal experimentation?
Great question. And I mean, I could talk about that specific topic for a while, but it is correct that right now the FDA requires any medical device or any pharmaceutical, it goes through what's called a 2-animal rule, which means it has to be tested in 2 separate animal species before it can go to human clinical trials. So that person's question is absolutely correct. The FDA regulations require right now, and usually it's tested in a rat and a dog, or a rat and a monkey, some combination of or all 3. And there actually was a pharmaceutical company, I think they were called Vanda Pharmaceuticals, a few years ago, that filed a lawsuit against the FDA on the exact basis that person said, saying, we don't want to do this animal testing because we know it's ineffective. We know it's ineffective and it's a waste of time. We want to go directly from the computer quantitative methods and from the cell culture to the humans, because that does give you the best data. That's just the facts. And a lot of the pharmaceutical companies know that. So I definitely think there is room for collaboration there. I will add one word of caution, though, and that is that some companies see this differently and actually see that the animal testing provides them with an opportunity to kind of manipulate things through the FDA approval process, okay? And the reason is because you can take your investigational drug, you can test it in a rat, a mouse, a rabbit, a monkey, a dog, and test it in 5 different species, and then get these 2 reactions that look the best. It's the safe and effective in the rat and in the rabbit. And that can be the data that you present to the FDA. So you can test it in all these animal species and then cherry pick it to try to force the FDA, not force, but to manipulate the FDA into giving you approval to go to clinical trials. Because for a lot of drug companies and for a lot of investors, just going to clinical trial is at least a short-term boon. And you'll see this yourself when you're looking at news reports about, you know, Eli Lilly gets FDA approval for clinical trials for the new Alzheimer's drug. Their stock will go through the roof even though that drug, like I told you before, I'm telling you, it has a 95% chance of failure. Okay. Doesn't matter. People don't know that. People don't read that fine print. So even getting into the clinical trials, these companies have a strong incentive just to even get to that point. So it's a complicated picture where you have pharmaceutical companies. And the other thing to remember too, the costs of bringing a drug onto the market, like 99% of that cost is the human clinical trials. The animal testing is pennies in terms of cost for that company. So they don't really care that much in terms of if they're trying to minimize their costs of bringing a drug to the market, they barely care about the animal testing. Even if they're strictly concerned about money and not wasting their time, they're constantly putting pressure on the FDA to shorten clinical trials. That happens all the time. But the animal stuff is just kind of like, yeah, that's some hoop we got to jump through, throw just a tiny bit of money for us at it. And so that's part of why it's not a priority for them, if that makes sense.
Interesting. I heard somewhere too that part of the thing is that these companies want to test on animals just to show that they've done their due diligence, so that if there is a problem in humans later down the road, they maybe can avoid getting sued because like they tried everything, like who would have known? I don't know if that's.
Yep, that happens as well. Yep, liability protection. That especially happens, by the way, even outside of it. Pharmaceutical companies are often already protected under the FDA approval process. They're given a large, unless they intentionally conceal data from the FDA, they're generally given immunity from the harm that their products cause to consumers, which is a little crazy to think about. But where that comes up a lot is household products. You know, your cleaning products, things you might find under the kitchen sink. Those products are often carried out animal testing for exactly the reason you cite, which is liability protection.
Interesting. FDA Modernization Act, what do you think of that?
So I have to be completely honest with you. I know this is a bit of a cop-out, but I have not myself have not done a deep dive on it. So
That's fine.
I know that the Physicians Committee's official position is lukewarm at best, and that it doesn't, from what I've heard from my colleagues, it doesn't do as much as it's stated to do. And there's concern that it won't change things as much as is being advertised. Okay. That's what I've heard from some of my colleagues. I have not myself read the text of the law, and I know that's kind of a cop-out, and it's something I probably should do my homework on, but that's the best I can give you.
Okay, cool. Leaf says, I don't know if he didn't put a star in front of his question, but I'll read it anyway. Doing human research would prevent animal cruelty, but would it possible to skip other species legally and financially? Would there have to be more studies than we already do on humans? I guess, like, kind of what does the future of research look like?
Well, I'll tell you this. So already the FDA, if there's an emergency, and they did this with the COVID pandemic, actually, and they also did it with the HIV pandemic. If there's an emergency, the FDA will actually approve of a drug going through clinical trials concurrently with animal testing, which is kind of wild if you think about it. So the humans participating in the clinical trials are participating in the clinical trials before we even get the animal data in. So we're in many cases, we're already there. We're already going straight to humans in a sense, but they still have to, before they can get the formal FDA approval, dot all the I's and cross all the T's through the regulatory framework and get that animal data. But in reality, lots of times when they go, hey, there's a real emergency here, we need to get a drug out there as soon as possible, they will start clinical trials. And the important thing to remember, by the way, about clinical trials, there's a saying in the field of toxicology. This is like a maxim. It's the dose makes the poison. Okay, anything can be toxic in the right dose. There's even such thing as water intoxication. You can kill yourself drinking too much water. Okay, so they so they know that. So what they do when they do clinical trials in that phase 1 studies, they start with microdosing. They'll give clinical trial participants a nanogram of something and look for very small changes in heart rate, in blood pressure, in whatever kind of symptoms they think this substance might look for. And then they'll slowly increase the dose up. So even though those humans are, in a sense, sorry for the speciesist expression, a guinea pig, there is still a very safe way under the supervision of a clinician to carry out clinical trials. And I have to tell you, like we were talking about, all this animal data is worthless anyway. So in the status quo, everyone who's participating in these clinical trials, I hate to break it to you, you are a guinea pig. Like, we don't know how that drug is going to react in you until we see how it behaves in humans. The animal data doesn't tell us a damn thing. It really doesn't.
I have talked to some people about that, and I'm like, it doesn't show us, but they insist that it will show severe toxicity. Like and they don't give me numbers for this, but they're like, you can predict severe toxicity if you test it in mice or something first. How do you respond to that?
I mean, if something is severely toxic, though, it'll probably be picked up in the in vitro methods as well.
Yeah.
So that'll be, we don't need an animal data to pick that up. You can tell that cyanide is toxic in vitro. So what we're looking for are more subtle systemic things, like you take a drug and first it goes into your liver, the liver metabolizes it and produces this metabolite, which goes into your bloodstream and ends up into your kidney, or et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of stuff, a non-human animal is not going to be able to give us good data for, because their body is going to, you have different enzymes, you have different proteins in those animal cells because they have different genes. And so you're just not going to see the drug behave the same, you know. And we see countless examples of this, right? You never give aspirin to cats, right? There's other examples.
Acetaminophen, yeah.
Or it's acetaminophen, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's the real bad one, but yeah.
That's the bad one. Sorry, my mistake. That's Tylenol, right? Tylenols that you never give to cats. So, I mean, this is, in a sense, isn't this also why we have veterinary schools? We have veterinary schools and we have medical schools. You learn about humans in one and animals in the other. And there's kind of an understanding that there's not a direct application between them, right? I mean, so, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And another question, thanks for the insightful talk. If you could change anything you want and however you want, what's your ideal procedure for conducting medical research? Taking Neuralink's brain surgery, for example, would you say the surgery should only be done on volunteers? What would Neuralink submit to the FDA to prove the safety of the surgery? Would you say these brain surgery should not be ever permitted because they can't prove it's safe without animal research? Would you say this research should wait until we can build a module level brain surgery simulation and prove the safety over there?
What a complex question.
Yeah.
So the first answer is yes, I think we absolutely should be using human volunteers. And in fact, there are teams of neuroscientists right now who are. There are human volunteers. It's commonly people who have paralysis that, you know, in a sense, like there's not anything to lose. So they're already undergoing brain surgery in many times. And these people will consent to an experimental device that might allow them to gain some sort of motor function again, or be able to communicate with the computer, even though they don't have control of their limbs. And we've already done that a lot. In fact, there's this viral video that Neuralink put out that maybe some people here have seen, of a monkey playing Pong with his brain, okay? So supposedly this monkey has an implant. I say supposedly because I don't really believe anything they say. Honestly, I've already seen them misrepresent things so much. But supposedly this monkey has an implant in their brain that's communicating via Bluetooth to control a game of Pong. And we're supposed to be amazed by this. This video was released in 2021. Listen to this, folks. When I was researching this, I found a study in the peer-reviewed literature from 2018 of a human volunteer doing the exact same thing, okay? It was a research team, I think it was at Pittsburgh University, a human volunteer playing Pong. And the reason Pong is an easy one to do is because Pong is a dichotomous variable. It can only go up and down. So it's easy to understand brain signals for a really simple thing like up and down. So we've already done this with human volunteers. At this point, they're just demonstrating in monkeys what we've already accomplished in humans. It seems pretty ridiculous.
That's frustrating. Oh.
Yeah.
How can we push back as students or concerned citizens short of getting arrested like Zoe?
Well, I would say I often fixate a lot on the transparency issue, because I think so much of this research continues only because people don't know about it. The media largely doesn't cover it. So if you're a student somewhere at a major research university, find other like-minded students, 2 or 3 of you even, it can be a small number, and dig into what your university's doing. File records requests just like PCRM did. Maybe see if you can attend your IACUC meetings. There's a handful of universities where these meetings are open to the public. Learn about what's happening to these animals. And you might learn some shocking things that you can then share on your social media or try to get the media's attention to. I definitely think the secrecy is part of what allows this whole thing to thrive. And it's a highly secretive thing. None of these laboratories give tours and look what they're doing. They were having to go to court even to just see photographs of the monkeys that are used in this Neuralink experiment. So I think that would probably be the first thing that I would suggest is if you're a student somewhere, or even if you're not a student, find out what laboratories are near you. Try to do some research. You can reach out to me. My email, let me go ahead and type it in the chat so people have it. I can maybe help as well, point you into some resources about how to research animal research in your area. And and then do all the typical activisty stuff, do demonstrations, try to do outreach to their staff. Just like you said, Crystal, they're not evil people. And many times you'll find people inside the laboratory that have had some part of their conscience in the back of their brain, and they may need someone like you to bring that out, someone that they can talk to about it and validate, and maybe they're like, I've always thought this is mean what we're doing with these monkeys, but I never wanted to say anything to these people. But now I see that there's this group of concerned people on campus. Maybe that's who I should reach out to. I can't even tell you in 20 years of working in animal research, I've probably spoken to 100 whistleblowers, truly, like people inside laboratories. Most of them never go public because they're too scared, but it's still a valuable experience. And some of them do go public, and some of them do go public and make waves and make changes. So, just start that process. I see a question right there that I want to answer. Yes, anyone can file these information requests.
Yeah, and I'm sure, Jeremy, I know how to do some too. So, I just want to say a plug for our honor. We have a bunch of veterinarians, vet students, pre-vet students who are all interested in these issues. So get involved with us and we can start talking. And it's good to know that there's lots of people out there that feel the same way you do. So, and then another question is, thanks so much for being here, Jeremy. A question, are there vaccine tests available that can avoid all animal use?
So this goes back to what I was saying a bit ago, which is that vaccines are considered pharmaceuticals. FDA is going to require, as of right now, that they go through animal testing. Do they have to go through animal testing from a scientific perspective? Absolutely not. And they can be tested in the same ways that we've discussed, through human clinical trials. They can be screened through in vitro testing. They already are screened through in vitro testing, often before the animal test data part. But there are really good alternatives that we already have. The clinical trials are really all that matters, to be honest with you. As I was doing a huge review of the literature about the COVID vaccines, for example. And the COVID vaccines, there were a lot of papers published in hamsters and in guinea pigs, especially, and in monkeys. And again, the data was all over the place. The hamsters said it was going to work against Omicron and then said it wasn't. And the mice said it was and wasn't. And we've kind of seen, I think, different sides of this vaccine debate kind of marshal different papers to their side. And they're not always misrepresenting these papers, to be honest. It's just that the animal data gives you a confusing mess of information. And the only way you can really learn how these vaccines work is through clinical trials and observational studies like epidemiological studies. And that's really the gold standard.
But what about vaccine testing in like dogs for the benefit of dogs? Like how do you envision that to happen ethically?
I would envision that working ethically through veterinary clinics. So veterinarians say, maybe they make an arrangement with their clients that would you like to enroll your dog in a clinical study that, we're going to make it as safe as possible, but we want to test this new vaccine that we have every reason to think is going to be safe and effective in your animal, but we're going to report back data on that, what happened to your animal to the manufacturer, and basically through a network of people's companion animals.
Yeah, makes sense. I can go on about like my vision for the future, but we have lots of questions, and I think that would be a great separate talk. Like, what does the future look like with experimentation where we don't do it this way with animals? Like, I have a lot I'd love to talk about there, but maybe some other time. And then somebody says, I worked at a horse farm here. They want to stay anonymous. I was required to get IACUC certified, but we never had any invasive research on this scale besides some things with body temps during parturition, and then my research projects with intestinal parasites. My question is, with those types of research and how those things would still be allowed if we were to end the horrible parts of research, the human medical trials on animals?
Yeah. That's a great question.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely correct. Like, I do think that there are ethical and appropriate ways to use animals in research in a very general sense. Okay, animal research is kind of a term of art that's kind of come to mean a certain specific thing. But generally speaking, animals can be participants in ethical research in the same way children can. Okay, you can have pediatric drugs can be tested in children in an ethically sound way. And it comes back to what I was describing earlier with those protections for humans in clinical trials, where you may not be able to get informed consent from an animal in the same way you can't get informed consent for a child. So sometimes what they do is they actually have someone appointed ad litem, which means there's someone who's there advocating for the best interests of that individual legally. That's their role, to advocate for their interests. And then if they're enrolled in a trial where there's something called equipoise, which means that that individual in the trial is just as likely to benefit from being in that trial as they are to being harmed from being in that trial, then that is an ethical way to use participants in a study for which they may not be able to consent to, or in cases where we think that the likelihood of harm is extraordinarily low. So I'll give you another example. I showed you those pie charts of all the animals used in research, education, and testing. The reality is when you dig into some of those numbers, like for example, the dogs, some of those numbers of the dogs that are reported to the USDA are not really invasive animal research. It's true. They're animals who, when I looked into this, are used in vet tech programs. And some of these programs are like vet tech schools that are connected to like community colleges or career colleges, where they partner with a local shelter. And the techs go into the shelter and assist with things like neuter and space surgeries to get some experience doing blood draws and finding a vein and, you know, inducing anesthesia, things like that. That's clearly fun. I mean, you know, people have to learn how to perform surgeries on animals. Vet techs have to learn how to perform spay and neuter procedures. So that's an ethical thing, even though that's technically reported to the USDA. Just like you said, that had to get IACUC approval because it meets the letter of the law of using an animal in research, testing, science, or education. So you're absolutely correct. You know, we can avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But there is a lot of bathwater. I mean, a lot of this is pretty awful stuff.
Mm-hmm. And just another question about somebody going into research. She's an animal science graduate. She's going to go work at a job in a lab for the first time. What is something she can do to help the cause or help others understand that it's important to realize, you know, some things aren't right?
Well, I guess, I mean, first, I would never suggest that someone actually become a direct participant in animal experimentation. You know, even if they think there may be some way to change things from the inside, I honestly find that even people who are in the inside end up creating the most change when they leave the system and are advocating from the outside. So, I mean, I would probably encourage someone just skip that step and just go straight to advocating for non-animal alternatives. You know, people who already find themselves on the inside, you know, of course they can do what they can to try to make things a little less bad. You know, I remember, for example, about 5 years ago, I got a phone call from someone who works at the cancer research laboratory at the University of Utah. And he said, I'm calling you because we're doing ovarian cancer research, and we just bred a couple litters of rats, and we don't need the males because we're doing ovarian cancer research. And they told me to kill all the males with carbon monoxide poisoning. And I don't want to do that. And I'm wondering if you would just take the rats. And he essentially snuck them out the back door. I think he even recorded in his reports that he killed them. And no one ever knew that, you know, right here behind me, I had like 12 rats for a couple of years. So, I mean, that's something that someone on the inside, you know, he probably went back to work on Monday and induced neoplasms in female rats. But, you know, he did at least get those rats out instead of needlessly killing them. So, you know, you might be able to find little things here and there that you can do to try to make things less bad, but we really have to try to take down the whole damn system, I think.
Yeah, I get that. I don't know. You've been doing this a lot longer than I have. I'm kind of new, but I do see some benefit in people bearing witness and going in. And because right now I talk about things like animal agriculture, and people say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You haven't done it. Even though I grew up in 4-H and all my neighbors raised pigs and cows, and I was an animal science major, like that's not enough. I'm not a livestock veterinarian, or I haven't worked in a slaughterhouse personally. So there is a benefit, I think, to people who actually have worked there and done it, who can speak from personal experience. If you can take it, I think that's really powerful to like live that and then go out and tell the story.
It's definitely an asset. I mean, you'll get a new perspective, you'll talk about it, but I don't think it's by any means necessary. I mean, you know, I was a staunch opponent of the Iraq war, but I've never been to Iraq. Yeah. I didn't see the war with my own eyes, but I was able to read reports of it and kind of use basic ethical reasoning to say this is wrong. And I think any one of us can do the same thing with animal research. I don't think any of us ever has to step foot inside an animal laboratory to just know animals are sentient beings. You know, they don't want to be hurt, just like I don't want to be hurt. The golden rule ought to apply to them too. And furthermore, it's common sense that we're not going to get very good data from them. And it's not just common sense. There have been, I mean, honestly, the scientific portion of my talk, it sounded like I was so long-winded, I think, but in reality, I could have talked another couple hours. There have been so many meta-analyses and reviews of animal-based research that have said, this is kind of a giant fraud. And I mean, honestly, I read publications every day at my job that are just insanely stupid experiments that are never going to result to anything meaningful for humans. But it's just become this perpetuating mill. People need to keep publishing papers. They need to keep getting grant funding. It's so much easier to just reach for a rat than it is to involve humans in a clinical study. That's a great, big, expensive, complicated thing. Reaching for mice, that's easy. And it's easy for you, and your institution's going to love it too. Here's a big thing that I didn't mention in my talk. All these grants that are awarded to the universities, about half of that grant money goes to the university's general fund. Those are called indirect costs. And that money can be used to help build new football stadiums, to pay professors' salaries, to build a new student life center, whatever it may be. That's all funded through animal research. So there's a very strong financial incentive to keep this all going.
Yeah, I get that too. And it's frustrating too, veterinarians, scientists who try to who do research in alternatives to animal testing, trying to get faculty positions at universities are rejected, denied, because the other faculty feel threatened by them. Yes. So you have people doing brilliant research in alternatives who are not able to influence the younger generation with their alternatives that will be safer and less cruel. Someone else asked, how viable are human clinical trials given the pushback from the public scene with the COVID vaccine? Like, will we have enough volunteers to do this?
I don't think that they, even to this day, have trouble enrolling volunteers. I mean, sometimes it comes with a hefty cash award. There is a problem sometimes in clinical trials about recruiting diverse demographics. So I can tell you, I lived for a while in Madison, Wisconsin, and there's a really large company there called Covance. And Covance does both, they're a CRO, contract research organization. I mentioned those earlier. Covance does both human clinical trials and animal testing. And they would enroll in clinical trials all the time in Madison. And they would say, and sometimes they would have what are called like metabolic ward studies, which means you actually go live at Covance for a few weeks under constant supervision. You're living there. They're collecting every single time you defecate or urinate. They're collecting that. They're monitoring you every single day, keeping you under very close watch. And in exchange for 3 weeks of that, you may get 10 grand. Not even kidding, 8 grand, 10 grand. Well, what they find is one of the problems they do have is who is signing up for that in Madison, Wisconsin. It's a lot of like 19 and 20-year-old men. That's just the reality of it. That's who is like, yeah, sure, I'll go take that risk and go live in those kinds of situations. I mean, you're not going to find many, people well into adulthood with children that say, I can go live for 3 weeks and have them test some experimental drug on me. So that can be a bit of a problem. And so, there are some structural problems that need to be overcome with clinical trials, but I don't think that that's an excuse to continue doing this wasteful, cruel animal stuff. We can work through some of these problems on clinical trials concurrently. We can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I am down to be a testing subject. I just know so many in this area, so many like tech bros who are all about the biohacking, and they're like, yeah, I probably want to sign me up for whatever Elon Musk is doing. Like, I'm down.
I've seen that. Yeah, I've seen that when I've looked at social media about the Neuralink thing. I've seen quite it's a borderline cult, actually. I think.
But I mean, you have people signing up for the military and like being astronauts. Like, we need to make being a test subject like a hero thing, like the same way we've made our military personnel heroes and police officers and firefighters, people willing to kind of take these risks to advance humanity in some way, or in theory. I don't know how much the military actually does that, but anyway. Is the FDA to blame here for requiring animal experimentation? Can the problem be solved if the FDA required no animal research? Is that the only thing standing in the way?
Definitely not.
FDA, yeah.
So remember back in my presentation, one of the earlier slides, I had that list of 6 general causes, 6 general reasons animals are in labs, right? And really, FDA regulations only come into play for one of those 6, and that was the modeling toxicity and drug response. But for example, the disease response stuff, the basic research. So that's another important distinction to talk about. There's basic research, and then there's applied research. Basic research is done without necessarily a specific application in mind. It's just adding to the reservoir of general human knowledge. This is what's happening mostly on university campuses. Professors of biology, neuroscience, whatever it may be, they're just wanting to learn more about how the marmoset brain processes visual stimuli. So they put electrodes in the monkey's brain, look at how the monkey's brain responds to visual cues, and then they collect that data and publish a paper. And that's essentially the end of it, okay? That's all completely disconnected from any kind of FDA requirement. They're not even testing an investigational drug or device. They're just carrying out a study on animals. And honestly, there's a lot of animal research like that. There's a lot of animal research like that. Most of what's happening at university campuses is like that. Or it could be, for example, maybe a famous one people are familiar with is Harry Harlow. Harry Harlow did these experiments in the 60s where he took monkey mothers and would separate the babies from the mothers, maternal deprivation experiments, and then basically watch as the young mother went, or the young baby went mad and has suffered severe psychological trauma from this maternal separation. So that was not because the FDA required anything. This was just a professor of psychology that wanted to understand something about monkey development and by extension, maybe human child development. So they did this experiment and then published some data and maybe went and presented at some conferences about it. So that's a lot of what's happening. Honestly, especially on university campuses. So it's completely disconnected from the FDA. Now, there is other stuff, of course, that's required by the FDA. There's also, by the way, some animal testing that's done as a result of EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, has some animal testing requirements for some chemicals. So there's definitely some regulatory industries that are responsible for this as well, but it's a complicated picture, and these are all being done for different reasons.
Yep, interesting. Thank you. It's been a long talk. I know people are probably tired, but thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to put this on YouTube, so if you want a link in the future to this talk, put your email in the chat, or you could sign up at ouronor.org for a newsletter and I'll share it there. Sad thing, I've shared videos on YouTube and it's been flagged for bullying because you angry animal rights activists bullying these poor people. So I hope that doesn't happen again, and my entire YouTube channel got taken down for bullying, for having these sorts of discussions. So I'll try again, but that might happen in the future. I'll also save it on a Google Drive or something too. But thank you so much, Jeremy. This was wonderful. And yeah, thank you all for coming. And I hope you all come to our next talk, which will be the 30th of April, 5 o'clock, same place. And I hope to have veterinarians tell stories of facing bullying and retaliation. And I invite anybody from industry to come talk and give their perspective. I want stories of bullying you've experienced from animal rights activists, veterinarians working in industry who faced internal bullying for voicing ethical concerns, all sorts of bullying stories. So if you have one, please reach out, ouronor.org. I'll put my email in the chat real quickly too before I close this, but you can reach out to me at cheath@ouronor.org. And yeah, I hope to see you all guys, all you guys soon. Bye.
Bye, thank you.